Those of you who are here on time deserve to be rewarded. I say welcome. Thank you so much for taking this time out on an autumn afternoon for this session. Throughout our nation's history, access to a quality education, as well as the content of education, has been a political battleground. And these struggles continue in states throughout the nation. In fact, in many districts, the outcome of the November 5th election will affect what is read and taught in the classroom. And as you all know, right-wing Republican leaders have proposed abolishing the federal Department of Education and really, clamping down on public access, increasing vouchers, et cetera. Now, historically, public schools were locally financed through property and state taxes, but the largest pool of public funds in the nation is federal income taxes paid by citizens. Given the critical importance of public education and maintaining, expanding a thriving society and economy, the nation needs to sharply increase congressional education budgets. Now, though not generally recognized, the federal contribution to public education and to housing, to healthcare, to public transit, and other human needs has been limited, sharply limited, in order to finance the excessive $884 billion military budget. In the interest of brevity, I don't show you a slide in which the former president says explicitly that he cut the NIH budget 18%, so he had money to increase the defense budget. With $884 billion military budget, which is an undercount, it's just not possible to significantly increase federal funding for education without cutting this bloated military budget. And the second panel will address this. Cole, could you put up the pie chart?
There it is.
So yeah, so this is a pie chart pre-discretion. This is pre-pandemic, right? And that light blue is even pre-pandemic, more than half the income taxes Americans sent to the federal government went to the military, and the education budget was essentially 70 billion, 6% of the budget. That actually has not changed very much up to the present. The numbers on the military side are larger, but the ratio is about the same. And if you think about the crises that schools faced by pandemic, of course, it should be just the other way around. There should be an enormous increase in federal funding for public education, given the actual need. But it hasn't even been a subject of discussion, right? It's absolutely absent from the presidential race. And those of us who were organizing this forum, we could not identify a congressional race across the country where public education was an explicit issue. However, in many of those states, public education is a critical issue brought through the state legislature and the state government. So it's around, it's in the air, but it's not part of the explicit debate. Now, of course, it's also true, as the educators here know, that some of the federal funds have been misused. When Betsy DeVos was Secretary of Education, the No Child Left Behind Act was really a mechanism of punishing teachers and students. And in fact, the situation is still very bad, and many educators don't look favorably on federal funding. But the fact that this is a lousy policy doesn't mean it can't be changed, right? It's not that we shouldn't have more federal funding for education. It's just that it should be used differently, and that's going to require a political battle. It's not going to happen spontaneously. Now, we have a very distinguished opening panel. Max, I'm going to go through who's speaking, and then we'll call on them. Max Page was elected president of the MTA May 2022 and reelected in April 2024. He's on leave from UMass Amherst, where he was professor of architecture. As an MTA leader, Page helped organize members to ensure passage of the Student Opportunity Act, one of the better Massachusetts bills. And as president, he has continued to fight for similar legislation to increase funding for public higher education with the goal of making it debt-free for students. Our second panelist, Jessica Tang, began teaching middle school social studies in Boston Public Schools 2005, served as the first director of organizing at the Boston Teachers Union up 2017, been a vice president of AFT Massachusetts and a vice president of the Massachusetts AFL CIO. She was the first person of color, first woman in more than 30 years to be been president of the Boston Teachers Union. Evan Mackay was critical in the organizing of the Harvard Graduate Student Union. Evan served as president of the UAW chapter, successfully negotiated improved working conditions. They recently ran for state rep, calling for increased transparency and democracy in the state legislature. He continues to be a voice in the community. Carrie Milner coordinates learning partnerships for the Cambridge Public Schools and has launched multiple coalitions and networks that bring public, private, and nonprofit providers together to support young people and the educators who work with them. The preschool and after-school programs are much more complicated to handle than the ones that are, under the school system. So Max is here with us. He's actually in the midst of canvassing for question 2. Max, take it away.
Great, Jonathan. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I just traveling from New Bedford. We were doing a canvas on to Fitchburg, and I thought I could make it to our Worcester office in time, but I'm not. So I'm at the rest stop on the Turnpike. So I hope it's you can hear me all. But
Yeah.
we are in the final 10 days. I know lots of people on screen are fighting hard for question 2. This time it's yes on question 2. And I know Ricardo Rossi, I was actually with him this morning down in New Bedford. I think he'll be talking later, so I won't discuss that, but I will just say that the fight over question 2 is a battle with the same forces that have led to austerity in our public schools and colleges. It's the same groups, unfortunately backed by some alleged friends in our own politics here in Massachusetts, who have fought for privatizing schools through charter schools, through not passing progressive taxes, which we did over their wishes. So it is the same fight. So very quickly, I know I'll try to keep it a high level, and then during the discussion, we can get into more details if you'd like. I felt like it's important to lay out some of the principles by which we approach kind of funding for public education. First thing I'm going to say is the title isn't quite right. Jonathan urged me as well to talk about this. We in the MTA represent 117,000 public school and college educators. And so we truly believe in a pre-K through 16 public education system. Frankly, we really believe in a birth through death access to free, high quality public education. That's crucial. We know that centrally money matters in public education. If it didn't, then people would not spend $25,000 per student a year in Wellesley, and less than half as much in communities that don't have the resources. So let's be crystal clear about that. And finally, just as a big principle, is that what I'm so proud of in the MTA is that over the past decade or so, we have been committed to the simple proposition. It should be simple, but it has taken a lot of people pushing hard on this. This proposition is that the conditions of our students outside of our public schools and colleges is as important as what happens inside. And we can't ignore that. We can celebrate the work of our educators as we do, the best in the nation, I believe. But if we do not address the inequality, the racism, the poverty that our students and their families face outside of schools, we're just not going to be able to achieve what we want inside. So that's kind of motivates us. I'll just very briefly kind of highlight some of the things that we're really fighting for, and our board just met to kind of ratify our budget requests. Clearly in pre-K-12, we want to continue the fight to have the Student Opportunity Act funded. That was an incredible victory in 2019. At the same time, we have to look already, even though we're 5 years into the Student Opportunity Act, look at fixing Chapter 70 more general. And I think Jessica will also address this. There's all kinds of ways in which Student Opportunity Act could not do or did not do all that we need to do, including living wages for all educators. Many of you have been part of, have seen the strikes that many of our locals have led, and at the heart of it are living wages for our education support professionals, the paraprofessionals, bus drivers, clerical staff, cafeteria workers. Relatedly is paid family medical leave for all educators. We are proud that the MTA helped win passage of the paid family medical leave. We didn't need to go to the ballot, but we won that. But it's not universal. It leaves out municipal workers. And so we really, and many of the strikes and other contract campaigns have been about guaranteeing a largely female workforce access to the same kind of paid family medical leave that all other workers in the state have. We're also very eager to keep pushing forward on, or really get launching and joining up with our BTU colleagues who are ahead of the game on this, which is more community schools, investing in community schools across the state. And perhaps Ricardo Rosa is leading that work for us. I will say just one other thing on, or a couple things more on pre-K-12 is we feel now, given how much the governor and the legislature have diverted fair share monies to private early ed and childcare, we need to get much more in that game. We do not represent those early childcare and early ed workers, but we really think we need to invest in truly public early education as much as possible, or at least do it through the public schools, even if they then have to outsource to nonprofit groups. But that should be a truly public system in an ideal world, and we have the funds to do it, get it. I'll just turn to public higher education funding. This could take hours to talk about how it's funded, but mainly it comes from the state. It used to come fully from the state, but what we have done over the past 25 years is disinvest from public higher education and shift the costs, privatize the costs over to students and their families, which is why we've had some of the highest tuition fees in the nation. It's led to the exploitation of adjunct faculty and the outsourcing of spending on capital, that is on repairing buildings and building new buildings. I'm very pleased, though, we've made big progress. There's the first year, this past year, it's the first steps towards true debt-free public higher education that I've had in my years in as a member of the union. And that, of course, was also supported, I will say, by the Biden administration's work on student debt relief. But it's to great credit that because of the Fair Share Amendment that we all together won, there is money to have debt-free public higher education. It started with community colleges, it really should go through to all four-year universities as well. So we're working very hard in public higher education to continue to work on having true debt-free public higher education, truly accounting for the full costs of attending a public college or university, investing in the wraparound services, the counseling and other supports so that students have a great experience and they get to graduation. There's a huge drop-off of students who may first be brought back and welcomed back with some good scholarships, but if we don't support them in their curriculum, in their support, they will drop out, and that's bad for them, and it's bad for the Commonwealth. We also have to address the stunning fact that in Massachusetts, if we compare our faculty and staff in community colleges, state universities, and UMass, we are at or almost at the bottom in terms of pay when you factor in the cost of living in Massachusetts. And that's compared to even other states that are high cost states like California. So this is just something we have got to confront as we want the high quality system as well as an accessible one. We need to give adjunct justice. I think we're going to be working hard so that adjunct faculty who sometimes teach 80% of the courses at our community colleges have, what a wild idea, health insurance, access to pensions, and frankly, access to full-time jobs if they so choose to have them. Part of the austerity model has been to turn these workers into gig workers. That's what the adjunct faculty and staff are at especially our community colleges, but at all three sectors. And that is a terrible injustice to them and to the students who attend the colleges, no matter how good they are. And our adjunct faculty are outstanding. They simply can't, they are not allowed to devote the kind of energy they would need if they had a decent pay and benefits or a full-time job. And I'll just close by reminding everyone that we remain fully committed and have been central players in the Raise Up Mass Coalition, which, remember, all of us together won many of those things that help, as I was saying, the outside of our schools and colleges, raising the minimum wage from $11 to $15. Hopefully now we'll get to $20. This almost universal paid family medical leave, which I just learned they have given out, and now I'm going to forget the number, but I learned from the secretary how much enormous amounts of money in benefits for that paid family medical leave program has gone out to hundreds of thousands of workers. Universal sick leave we want. And of course, we run progressive taxes. When you ever hear a politician brag about the things that they've won, I hope they'll also acknowledge, that is, whether it's free community college or universal school meals, I hope they will always acknowledge that it was the people who helped win the Fair Share Amendment alongside legislators who advanced it. So I will, I think, end there to note that that work will continue to go on, and I hope we can all band together to win the kind of funding from the federal government as well as the state for the kind of public education system we deserve.
Thank you so much for clarity and leadership. We'll go directly on to Jessica Tang and then take some questions on the two talks. Jessica, are you on board? Yes, there you are. Please.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. And thanks for having me here. And Max, I think that was a great outline of what the needs are, certainly moving forward. I was asked to speak about a K through 12 unfunded mandates. And, I was thinking about this and I was like, well, high quality public education has been an unfunded mandate historically. I mean, like literally just the whole concept of really providing high quality public education for all students. But I can definitely give some specific examples of how that shows up in our classrooms and in our schools. And I'm going to start with just like the classroom level, right? And at the classroom level, we're talking about the fact that for decades, we did not have enough basic materials for our students, whether that's books. I remember when I first started teaching, I had over 90 students and I had about 30 books. And so they could not take the books home. And throughout the year, because I had 2 semesters, it was really 180 students. But, I regularly hear about chemistry labs where they don't have enough materials, or, if they're in dual bilingual school, that they don't have the materials in translated in the 2 different languages. And so teachers spend a tremendous amount of time just translating material so that they have bilingual curriculum. So if we're just talking about, basic facilities too, in terms of what our students have access to for facilities. We joke about it, but it's actually not funny. But we'll call, the gym/auditorium, the gymatoriums, or, we don't have a playground, so they have their gym class in a hallway. Facilities have been, I think, historically underinvested in, and there have been decades of deferred maintenance, results in lack of high quality access to just facilities for our students. And then I can go to staffing as another example. For example, in Boston, there is a commitment for special education inclusion. However, the district has not been providing high quality special education because it has not provided adequate staffing to we have what we call inclusion done right. And so instead you'll have one teacher with, and I apologize, I just realized that I was getting into a little bit of the weeds. Special education inclusion is essentially the idea that some of our special education students who normally would be in a different classroom, or called the substantially separate classroom, would be included with our quote unquote regular ed students as well, including also multilingual learners too. And it's a great concept and idea, and it's more inclusive of our neurodiverse students. But in order to do it well, you need to have special education services provided by a special education teacher as well as gen ed teacher. And then if you also have multilingual learners, ensure that they are getting their ESL services as well. But when you have one teacher with 3 licenses trying to provide the supports for all of those students, it does not go well. And that's another example of how staffing is often underfunded. Another one is we talk a lot in public education about the impacts of the pandemic on social emotional health and well-being. Well, first of all, that happened even before the pandemic. But while there has been, I think widespread acceptance that we need to have more social workers and guidance counselors and behavioral health, school psychologists, et cetera, that has continuously been something that's been underfunded. We have many, many, many schools across the districts that do not have the recommended ratios for our mental health providers and our students. So I'm kind of zooming out a little bit more, but the other ones that I'm just going to touch on a little bit too are, again, the concept of universal pre-K. It kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of high quality public education. And I agree with Max, it's pre-K through higher ed, but it's really birth and beyond. But we have not been able to provide universal pre-K because it has not been something that's been funded throughout our state. And that continues to be a challenge because we know a lot of the gaps when we're talking about closing opportunity gaps start at a very young age, really at birth. And those gaps can actually be very great even before a student gets to kindergarten. And certainly by the time that students are in 3rd grade, if they're not reading on grade level, that is a crisis already because we switch from teaching students how to read to learning and reading to learn. So that's another example. But then I'm also going to, extend that to not just what we're providing pre-K and through elementary school, but also Mass Core. So in Massachusetts, we have a recommended course of study called Mass Core. And we also have recommended standards for all the different subjects and whatnot. But the reality is that has not been fully funded either. And so many of our districts have not adopted Mass Core completely because they actually don't have the funding to provide, for example, the 2 years of foreign language. And all of the different courses that are required for Mass Core. And so Boston, for example, does not actually have all of the courses that are recommended for Mass Core in all of its high schools because it doesn't have the funding to provide the staffing to provide Mass Core. And that's, I come from Boston, and so I use Boston as some of these examples, but at AFG Mass, we also represent Lawrence, Lowell, Lynn, Salem, Chelsea, and a number of other large urban districts, and we see that happening in those places as well. And then the last one that I will spend a little time on is on testing. So the federal government requires testing at certain grade levels, 3 through 8, and then plus the 10th grade. And the school districts and government spent so much money just on paying for testing. And it's not just paying for testing itself, but it's paying for a lot of curriculum, test prep materials, something called ANET, all these test prep courses. So we're paying for testing we test our students to make sure that they can pass tests. And the amount of money that is going to the testing industry, because it's not even just that, we already do a lot of other assessments too, which are good assessments oftentimes, but we have to do additional testing because of the high stakes test-based system that we have. Which is why question 2 has been such a big issue for educators in the state and transforming the accountability system that's based on these high stakes tests. It's really incredible how much money goes into test prep, and then testing to make sure that students can pass this test that doesn't even actually measure everything that's in the Mass Core standards or the Massachusetts standards in general. So I think I will pause there, but I was trying to just give a sense of the different levels of unfunded mandates, whether it start in the classroom with just basic materials, all the way up to policies. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one on my list. Another one is educator diversity initiatives. So there's been a big push and, acceptance that we are not doing as much as we can and should be doing to increase educator diversity. But again, the pathways and programs that help to ensure that there are pipelines not only for recruitment, but also for retention, those are oftentimes not funded as well. Or you have to try to get grants or apply for programs for districts to be able to fund those educator diversity initiatives. And it's again one of those problems where you can't fix it if you don't actually fund it.
Thank you. All right, very cogent description of what it's really like on the ground. Why don't we take a few questions before moving to the second part? Please use, the raise your hand button under React. And
Jonathan, this is Hayat. Do you
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
keep track of hands?
just look for a hand.
Okay, we'll
I
do.
can't see the
Yeah.
I can't see too many people.
You can change to gallery view if you want to see the faces.
Yeah, change
The virtual hands, nobody has raised one yet.
All right. Well, if you have real clarity of presentation, sometimes you don't need additional questions. We'll have time at the very end. Let's move on to Max talked about higher education. Evan Mackay has, represented graduate students. Evan, why don't you share your concerns and experience with us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for attendees for being here. Thank you to the fellow panelists. This is really important to be thinking about the role of federal funding in a lot of our struggles for education justice. So my name is Evan Mackay, they, them, theirs pronouns. I'm the former president of the Harvard Graduate Students Union, currently on the executive board of the Greater Boston Labor Council, and I'm also a MAPA member. So I'm here with Books Not Bombs, also uplifting the Warheads to Windmills campaign and climate justice, seeing a lot of these things as interconnected, and just want to accent the fact that MAPA is doing a whole lot of work in addition to these virtual opportunities. So I was with UAW members and with MAPA at an action on Wednesday in Cambridge, making sure that Nancy Pelosi doesn't forget the need and importance for a ceasefire and knowing that people support peace. So there's a whole lot of interconnected work in our struggle. But I wanted to talk first about federal funds and how the federal budget is really important towards education. So higher education of all different types is dependent on federal funding. So federal funds, I can speak specifically to Harvard, where I work, where I am a graduate student, and where I have represented workers who are dependent on this institution for paying rent, paying our bills, providing healthcare and things like childcare. So federal funds account for about 1/8 of the university's revenue, and that's over 2/3 of the university's research funding, and that's $625 million. Just large scales of money that I think is missed when the prevailing wisdom is that education is a state issue. And I think that that's something that I want to keep on underscoring, is that all levels of government are involved in education and education justice. And the federal government might have particular opportunities towards progressive revenue without letting out off the hook any of these other levels of governance. And so the way that it works for graduate workers, for our labs, is that a large amount of our funding comes from these federal agencies, especially the NIH, the National Institute for Health, and then the NSF, the National Science Foundation. So very different from a law school or a medical school where people are providing tuition for receiving this education as like a good in exchange for money. Graduate workers in PhD programs, graduate workers conducting research are paid for the research, for the teaching that we are doing. So many of my coworkers are involved in teaching for undergraduate students, for graduate students, for adult students out in the world who are taking courses at Harvard. Many of us are also providing research that is essential towards the status quo of the institution. And so it's not that Harvard is always paying for these students, it is the grant money, sometimes that students ourselves apply for and then receive. So first of all, why is the NIH, why is the NSF providing this money? Why do these pots of money exist? These pots of money exist to invest in future scholars, investing in fundamental research, basic research, as well as applied research to healthcare, to climate science, to social science. And a large part of this is because academia, knowledge production, dissemination of knowledge, these are things that at their root can be a market failure. So if they're not immediately profitable, then it is very difficult to get them funded on the status quo outside of these other sources of funding. For example, the federal government. So there is a robust startup economy. There are many ways to monetize and make a whole lot of money from the sciences, from all of the lab spaces that we see throughout Massachusetts. But a great deal of this isn't immediately profitable, which is why it would be, and I would say continues to be, underinvested in, despite the existing amount of federal dollars that go towards this higher education research. So that's why the money exists. How does this work? Is through very competitive applications that professors put together, that graduate students put together. And you're putting together an application to choose to try and be chosen for why your research agenda should be chosen to receive this pot of money instead of many other wonderful research agendas also out there. So they're very competitive. For the National Science Foundation, GRFP, the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, you can only apply once in graduate school. And so there are many research agenda that are not funded just because of how competitive it is and how this amount of funding has not increased with the number of people in this line of work. And so that's a little bit about where this money comes from and why it exists. And then I also want to talk about who is receiving this money, who are the workers. So as I said, from the Harvard Graduate Students Union, we are affiliated with the United Auto Workers. Graduate students now more than ever are coming from very diverse backgrounds. Many students are the first person in their family to go to college or the first person in their family to go to graduate school. Many people are coming from low-income backgrounds. And there existed in the past this sort of myth that a lot of people in graduate school were already individually wealthy, were coming from backgrounds of generational wealth, and that there wasn't this need for funding, for money, that people could put aside their lives and that they would have savings to draw from to pay for things like rent or starting a family. But right now, with so many more people coming from a variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds, people are faced with the reality that it is their graduate stipend, it is the money that they apply for and receive that is going directly towards paying rent, that is going directly towards childcare and healthcare and the many other costs that people depend on. And so that's why people came together to form a union. I was very involved in that in 2018 and then served on the bargaining committee, ultimately serving as the president of the union. But we do a lot to try and involve our members in these struggles, thinking about our power and our decision-making coming from our membership, as well as our relationships with the community. And yeah, so these are who the workers are. And then related to funding and related to Harvard, another thing that I wanted to talk about is that under the status quo, Harvard and many other so-called nonprofits are exempt from property taxes within Massachusetts. And so they pay these things called pilots, which are payments in lieu of taxes. PILOT is pilot. And there are the Harvard Graduate Students Union and I and many people on this call are part of a coalition trying to push for pilot reform, trying to make sure that Harvard, which has bought up so much more property and reduced the property tax base in so many municipalities, including Cambridge, including Boston, should be paying more of more resources towards our municipalities and more resources towards the common good. And I think that our next panelists can talk a little bit about where these resources go towards in terms of the education justice benefit in terms of after school and childcare and early childhood education. But I just wanted to make sure that we're thinking about Harvard as this institution that is very adept, very well resourced compared to competitors in helping people apply for these scarce pots of money that exist out there from the federal government, from the NHS, from the NIH. But then Harvard is simultaneously not giving back in the way that it should be, or not compelled to be giving in the same way that any other institution would be that is not these nonprofits. So Harvard, this oldest corporation in the Western Hemisphere, this richest institution of higher education in the history of the world, is leading towards this underfunding of the basic and humane and high quality education that so many people in our community deserve. And so there's a lot more that I could talk about, but I want to hear questions and want to hear from our next speaker.
Gotcha. Thank you, Evan. Very, very helpful. Kind of bring things out of the closet into the daylight. Our last speaker on the panel one, Carrie Milner from Cambridge, is deeply involved with the preschool and after-school programs, which have often fallen by the wayside, but it's getting to be of increased importance. Carrie, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks everyone for showing up today, being part of this event. Carrie Milner, co-executive director of Cambridge Agenda for Children. We support out of school time, which encompasses after school and encompasses summer programs, pathway programs, other types of transition programs across the city of Cambridge. I'm anchored in the school department, hence my affiliation there. And we really work with other associations, other agencies, other nonprofits, other departments across the city to think about ways to support families, and particularly families with young children as they grow up through our systems. Right. So as I hear folks talking today, and we think about what are the types of investments or what are the types of changes that need to be made in order to produce different results, we know there has to be a stronger continuum of care. And needs to be some hard decisions made about maybe disrupting certain practices that are currently prevalent. And we need to hold ourselves accountable as communities, whether it be an election season or not. So I'll build upon some of the great comments that have already been made today. But I just, taking a step back, I think we're all familiar with the statement that, systems are working to deliver the results they were designed for. Right. And so as we think about question two, or we just think about assessments and tests that have been mandated for a long time now, we need to stop thinking about them as though they quantify or visualize discrepancies just of the so-called achievement gaps and the other actual opportunity and access and resource gaps. They're not supposed to be the dipsticks or the thermometers telling us that something is unwell with our students, with our teachers, with our schools or our districts. Instead, we need to start thinking of these assessments and tests more like EKGs that are measuring and charting the waves of how the systems they're built upon to sustain inequity are in fact quite healthy. And trust that the pulse of those systems remain constant and strong through each and every election cycle. So one way to think about and be motivated by this realization, and a lot of us here, I think, wake up each morning knowing this, is we need to flex and create systems change. Right, and we think about systems and how to change them. We know there's a lot of attributes to that. There's a lot of talk of policy and practices, of course, that contribute to the structures, how resources flow, how budgets are aligned. We heard about, how the government allocates funds in more competitive ways. I've been involved with a number of grants that essentially are initiatives that are almost like Band-Aids, like targeting a certain neighborhood or a certain school or a certain grade level, but not really incorporating lessons learned to impact across a system. So it's kind of these explicit ways that are named that here's the strategy, here's the funds behind it, here's the policy or the practice. Of course, it's also backed up by the relationships, the connections that folks have, the power dynamics that are at play. And those include a lot of, hidden arrangements, right? In terms of folks saying they're about one issue at the same time making compromises on their own behalf that torpedo certain types of progress. And we have to be willing to name that when that's happening. We have to be willing to disrupt that if we're involved in that ever. And only then will we really start to see certain things change. Then at the foundation of all this, which is aligned with some of this, these hidden agreements, are the mental mindsets, the models that have been baked into us, with implicit bias being something that each and every human has to carry with themselves each day. Of course, the explicit biases and the discrimination that has been used to build our systems, build our country, build our communities. And I think when we start to look at all of those areas and more that contribute to how systems thrive, right? And then, going back to like, what are these assessments and these tests and these conversations that we're talking about that reveal inequity telling us, again, the systems as the way it's set up is working just fine. It's healthy. And so my work with the Agenda for Children, my work with looking at out of school time, partnering with folks in the preschool community, in some ways it's thinking about education systems reform in a creative way, right? And when we invest in preschools and we invest in after schools, these are ways of reforming the way the systems support our public, and especially those with the highest needs. In Cambridge, we're fortunate after many years to have started to invest in universal preschool or pre-K, depending on which jargon we're using that day. And what I can say about that is it has had a huge, sort of amount of buzz and a decent amount of positive receptiveness, and it's really helped a lot of families who need it. Right on the heels of that, we're talking about how do we create more of a universal set of access points to after-school programming and summer programming, because currently we have hundreds of families on waiting lists, and many of them are in the youngest grades. In every community, you can ratchet up that number depending on the size of it or reduce it, but we do not have the capacity to serve the needs of our young people and our families in our communities. And that's true in many ways in school, but especially out of school. And so I think I'll kind of wind down by saying this, that one thing we've found and is really important to pay attention to as we think about setting goals and pushing for change is, who are these systems and who are these strategies being designed around? Who are they being designed for? Who are they being designed with? Right? And so even with universal pre-K, I think it is the typical practice that the funding supports basically a school day schedule, right? Federal or local funds, they're supporting a day that ends around 3 p.m. And so for families, and I have, 3 kids myself who've had to use preschools, we know they should be aligned with the needs of the family and anybody who's working. We don't end our day at 3. And so for the family and the programs and the nonprofits in the cities, they have to do I'll go through all types of gymnastics to figure out how to fund different families' needs beyond 3 p.m. And then even in our city, the programs that end at 3 p.m. that are preschool age, that are housed in our school buildings, there is no option for after school for those families. These are things we're trying to figure out. But again, it's because the system's designed around adults. It's designed around other priorities and not the students, not the young people, not the families. And that's also why we have this separation of funding between school day and after school. These things are not designed to support the family, to support the community, to support the outcomes that we really need to disrupt inequity. So I'll just close by saying, if we're going to push for systems change, let's make sure we center that change around the folks we want to benefit most from that change.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. We have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand. Use your raise hand button. Maybe I'll start off. Who pays for example, the pre-K program you talked about? Who pays for that? Where does that money come from?
In Cambridge. So
Yeah.
a lot of it is city funded in our case. There's other streams of funds that are coming in, but the primary funding stream is through the city, and then is partnering with the school department as well. But there are federal streams as well. And when you think about licensing and you think about professional development of the field, and our educators who have to deal with their own pecking order, again based on biases and otherwise, preschool and after school workers are below the public school educators, below higher ed, below private, etc. So there are other funding streams that support the professionals, maybe through the state and through other means, but the majority is about the city itself investing in it. But again, it's a shortfall because it's not taken into account the full waking hours of young people.
Gotcha. Okay.
Any
Edith,
questions from
my
Edith? Yeah.
screen shows you have your hand up.
Yes. So Kari, thank you so much. I really appreciate your comments. Also, Evan, in the work in early childhood and early literacy, which is so critical. So thank you very much for outlining the landscape of challenges. I guess my question is, the connection of early education is so critical in the lives of children, those group dynamics and how they develop those social skills, but also their budding academic skills and their readiness skills to tackle the challenges of later grades. So for me, one of the biggest things is connecting students to an environment where their cultures, their literacies, their funds of knowledge, and their bodies of information that are hardwired to their linguistic identities, as well as the cultural ways of knowing, are so important. Is there movement around decolonizing curriculum so that the identities, the heritage, the cultures, the languages of children are reflected in these preschool programs? Because I see that as an entry point to really reform and restructure the system so that children see themselves. When they see themselves, then you can create an aspirational environment, because some of the research says that even in preschools, suspension, expulsion, disciplinary approaches are disproportionately impacting students, Black and Brown, who come into these environments, and they're often expelled.
Mm-hmm. Is that a question I should respond to,
Yeah.
or how do you want to do it, Jonathan?
Yeah, why don't you just respond?
Well, just to be transparent, the main focus of my work is K-8, K-12 really, but with a lot on K-8. But I have a lot of colleagues in the preschool sector and who are working on UPK, and folks in the school department as well who are now leaning into the preschool arena, to your point, supporting curriculum, supporting professional development and coaching of preschool teachers. I think there's a risk, not a direct answer to your question, but part of what I'm hearing inferred there is, what is the risk when that is not taken into account? We don't take into account uplifting culture, uplifting voice, affirming identity, particularly for folks from a diverse range of backgrounds, from race and ethnicities that typically are not allowed to have as much access, while others are kept in positions of power. And I think the victory that we could have around this is to make sure the questions you're asking get asked and not remain silent. Because it's very easy to say, oh, we're doing this UPK in order to get the kids' grades up, in order to close this achievement gap, in order to make them school ready. I'm not saying those are bad ideas and that there are evil thoughts behind that, but they're not centering the real set of issues that still contribute to keep our young people from succeeding at their highest levels, because you're not lifting them up as individuals. You're not building a culture in which we have high expectations for all young people. And I'll finish with this, that both in preschool and in after school spaces, this is another reason why it's a sneaky reform change strategy. You can do so much more with curriculum. You can do so much more with centering culture, not just learning about civics, but how do you engage in civics, learning the history of things in your community that otherwise you would never know, that actually could uplift our young people and our educators in different ways.
Thanks. Max Page's hand up. Max.
Yeah, I only wanted just to add in response, Edith, is this is interesting. A question came up similar, but about high schools at a forum I was on question 2. And I think one of the benefits of de-emphasizing high stakes testing is the opportunity to have more time in classrooms to have a richer curriculum that talks about the issues you've just spoken about. Because, I routinely ask educators how much time is lost from real in-class learning due to the high stakes testing and then the tests to prepare students for the MCAS that Jessica was talking about. And it's routinely weeks, sometimes a month. They feel like they've been taken away from the real curriculum. And so that's one of the side benefits, an important side benefit of hopefully the victory on question 2 is allowing more space for a richer curriculum.
There we go. All right. Well, I think with those comments, we'll close panel 1 and move on to panel 2. It's chaired by Representative Carol Doherty. She's a former president of the MTA, former elected member of the Taunton School Committee, former faculty at Northeastern, and now in the legislature, actually fighting for education funding. Carol?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. I have a special affinity to my connection to MAPA through my connection to the Jobs with Peace campaign 40 years ago. And as I participate in these conversations and have in the past, I never go away without learning something new. And as a legislator, what it is that is presented to all of us and to me in this instance particularly is so important to have a full picture of the work that is before us and who we need to align with and what it is that we need to do in order to move the agenda forward. And I have to thank MAPA for always keeping these issues in the fore, keeping them before us, reminding us of what the true condition of the funding from the federal level anyway, in this instance, is for public education. And I have been an educator long life, all my life, as far back as I can remember, so I appreciate it. So my panel that I am facilitating is going to focus on sources of federal funds, and I'm going to share with you the little brief bio of the panelists who are participating. If you want to wave when I mention your name, if you're not brought forward in a big frame, please do that. So first, Bianca Singh. She is a senior policy analyst at the National Education Association within the Education Policy and Implementation Center. Hi, Bianca. In this role, Ms. Singh, is that correct? Singh leads the NEA's regulatory work with the U.S. Department of Education, provides technical assistance on federal grant programs, and covers federal funding for public education. Prior to joining NEA, Ms. Singh worked as a policy analyst at the American Association of Colleges of Nursing. Our second panelist, Deborah Weinstein, has been executive director of the Coalition on Human Needs since 2003. At the Coalition for Human Needs and previously at the Children's Defense Fund and the Massachusetts Human Services Coalition, Debbie has helped advocates to combat poverty and hardship for about 40 years. Thank you for that service. Our third panelist, David Boris, is a leader of the Chicago Area Peace Action and has spearheaded the development of campaigns to, campaigns to limit the expensive and dangerous replacement of the fixed silo ICBMSs. And our final panelist, Mary Najmi Haimiri, is a former president of the Mass Teachers Association, just like me. Prior to that, and Max, well, he's present president. Prior to that, she was, so it's, let's see, she was an elementary teacher for 23 years in Concord. She served as president of the Concord Teachers Association for 11 years and as a member of the MTA Board of Directors for 6 years. Currently, Mary is a leader of efforts to establish a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. So as a facilitator, I'm going to try to keep you to the 6 minutes that you have available to you. You might stray over a little bit, but we want to make sure that all of the panelists get their due amount of time to fully express what their issue is. and that there is sufficient time for Q&A from the audience. So we will start with Bianca. And I'm going to give you a minute. I'll tell you when you've got a minute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak on federal funding in public education. And so I was asked to speak largely about the federal discretionary budget and how that provides funding for public education. As you can imagine, federal funding is a very political process. And as our previous panelists have said, you know, in an ideal world, we probably would love to see more of that federal budget to education programs because they are so critical. But in the world of education, we have been fortunate over the past 4 years to have a president in the White House who has prioritized public education funding and has advocated pretty heavily in the appropriations process to see increases in education funding programs across the board, with historic investments made throughout the course of the pandemic. Speaking to fiscal year 2024, which is our current budget that we're operating under, the federal government has appropriated $79.1 billion to the Department of Education solely as discretionary funding. And so although this amount is a decrease from the previous fiscal year, I know that many of us who do track appropriations and federal funding were eager to see even the smallest of increases for key education programs. And so one kind of component of that I will note is that Congress is operating under statutory budget caps, and that essentially freezes all non-defense discretionary spending. And so being mindful of that, even those small increases did feel significant. As a quick clarification, I just want to highlight the difference between discretionary funding and mandatory funding, as those are two different buckets. I'm speaking about discretionary funding that is subject to the appropriations process, where Congress will set a new funding level each fiscal year for programs covered in that bill. And about 1/3, or about $1 trillion of the federal government's activities are funded through appropriations legislation. And almost all of education programs are funded as discretionary programs. On the other hand, we have mandatory spending, and that is just simply spending that doesn't take place through the appropriations legislation. And mandatory spending includes things like entitlement programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and other required interest spending on the federal debt. Mandatory spending does account for that other 2/3 of all spending, and in most cases, mandatory spending is ongoing funding, so it's going to occur every year regardless of change in law, whereas discretionary spending won't occur unless Congress acts each year. So when you hear things like the government's about to shut down, that is because Congress has yet to pass an appropriations bill. We're currently on what is called a continued resolution. And so if the government doesn't fund something, further, then the government would shut down. Thankfully, we've kind of surpassed that, and we're not really in that place right now, at least until December. And so when we talk about education funding, historically, the US has spent an average of only about 2 cents of every federal dollar on education. The federal contribution accounts for no more than 10% of education spending nationally. And the reason I highlight those two numbers is they are significantly lower than I think many people think. They think that federal funding accounts for a large portion of education spending, but it actually isn't. And so these funds, the federal funds, are distributed to states and school districts through a variety of formula and competitive grant programs, and that's why they'll vary significantly from state to state. If you look at years 2021 through 2023, that percentage might seem slightly elevated. We might be looking at a percentage that's like 14%, and that's largely because of the pandemic relief funds that were given, and those were historic for those years. But within the discretionary budget, we do have essential programs that fund portions of public education, and those are largely critical to existing laws like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. If you were familiar, we did reauthorize that in 2015 as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, and that replaced No Child Left Behind. So we no longer have No Child Left Behind. The Every Student Succeeds Act is what governs pretty much K-12 education. And you're likely familiar with some of the funding under that, and it's often referred to as title funding. So of the $79.1 billion that's appropriated for the Department of Education, about 44.7
1 minute.
goes towards K-12 education, and the other portion is going to be dedicated to post-secondary. And so we're looking at, Title I grants to states. That's going to make up a large portion of it, but there's also things like special education grants kind of covered under IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Kind of as a precursor of why I wanted to highlight some of those broader numbers is that while the federal contribution seems so low, it still is increasingly important to keep an eye on who is in office. And largely we're talking about the White House, but also just elected officials in Congress. Congress appropriates these bills. And so we want to make sure that we have pro-public education advocates that can push for increased funding when it comes to those decisions between money that's going to serve students across the country and then funds that might get sent to other agencies or to defense. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Right to the minute, and well done. Very much appreciated. Our second panelist is Deborah Weinstein. She will be speaking about the imbalance of civilian versus military budgets. Deborah, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Carol. Thanks for presiding over this, Jonathan. Thank you. And Bianca, that was a terrific presentation. I think I'm going to rashly try to share my screen and see if we can make this happen. Okay, let's see. That's looking promising. I'm just going to try to turn it into an actual slideshow.
It's okay, we can see it.
Okay, here we go. Again, thanks for letting me join in and for everyone spending some time on a Saturday on this. I wanted, there's so much we could be talking about, and I wanted to focus a bit on the Pentagon contractors part of the Pentagon budget, which is a very big part of it, and contrasting that with human needs. So let me start with something I think you know the general outlines of, and that is, if you look at this chart from a fairly conservative or moderate source, Peter G. Peterson Foundation, they are pointing out that the US spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. And that is a lot. So a few numbers that I wanted to just share, starting with how much does the Pentagon spend on weapons contractors? That's that first one. About half of its budget goes for those kinds of companies that are making weapon systems, other things that the Pentagon buys. That more than half was the cut to the tax rate for those Pentagon contractors that came about as a result of the Trump 2017 tax cuts, down to about 14%. So that's significant too. I'm trying to convey certain things about a power alignment here, as I think you will be realizing. Related to a power alignment, at least 50 members of Congress own stocks in weapons contractor companies. So these are important things for us to be remembering about. We should also be remembering, you heard a lot from Bianca about the general outlines of spending. Well, Pentagon spending has risen much more than domestic and international appropriations. We start looking from 2010, which was just before some fairly stringent caps were applied, and those caps hit the domestic area a lot harder. Well, during that period from 2010 to 2023, as you see, on the Pentagon side, counting inflation, spending up 24%, on the domestic and international side, up 4%. If you factor in population growth, obviously the more people you have, the more it costs to maintain services for the same, say, proportion of people. If you add that in, we're actually down 3%. So the kinds of programs like education that are a main focus here have been hit because of the constraints on spending. I've only got a few minutes, so I'm only going to give a few examples.
You have 2 minutes, so you're good.
Right. No, that's okay. But I'm not going through the whole budget, and you've certainly heard a lot about education. So I was charged with saying a little bit more about some of the other areas. So just some examples, which I'm calling here craven stinginess. There are currently right now waiting lists throughout the country for older Americans to receive Meals on Wheels. If we had $200 million, and CHN has just signed a letter that organizations are being asked to sign for that $200 million, we're asking Congress for it, that would serve 650,000 more older adults and end those waiting lists. So that's something that's before us right now that we need Congress to act on in the lame duck session after the election. In my other examples, advocates can succeed. We did prevent waiting lists from happening in the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program. They needed $1 billion to prevent waiting lists, and we did succeed in that in the last year. But that we had a struggle like crazy to get it. And there was even a thought that we would cut or put on waiting lists babies, children, and women is just outrageous. And then looming an example outside of health, outside of nutrition, excuse me, it is health. At the end of 2025, the Affordable Care Act extended premium tax credit will expire if Congress doesn't act. That's now saving on average about $2,400 per family or $700 for an individual. Those premiums are free to everybody who is poor or near poor. It would cost $335 billion over 10 years. Let's, if you made it even, that would be $35 billion a year. Think of all that money that's being spent on the military, some of which could pay for these extraordinarily important examples. One more extraordinarily important example. We reduced child poverty almost in half. If you see where that, I've got a red circle there, and you see a downward dip. When we passed in 2021, a big improvement in the child tax credit, it had an immediate gigantic effect in reducing poverty. Then you see the line go up again. That was because Congress allowed that to expire. So a major priority would be getting that back so we can reduce poverty among children in this country. Well, need versus greed. I'm using some examples from Massachusetts and Boston because I know a lot of the people on are from there. On the side, just last month in Massachusetts, more than 500,000 people said that they sometimes or often didn't have enough to eat in the previous 7 days. That's more than 1 in 10. but there are efforts to cut food programs. I described some of them. There's big effort to try to cut the SNAP, used to be called food stamp program as well. In the Boston metro area in 2023, half or more are paying more than 30% of their income on rent, and that is high for everybody and somewhat higher for Black and Latino renters, as won't surprise you. But right-wing opposition has proposed dramatic cutbacks in affordable housing, opposes expanding it for sure. There are also proposals to privatize it. So we have to fight back. And I'm just going to mention a couple of very limited but very useful things that we can work together on. Congress has, through now, required that the various military branches submit what they call their unfunded priorities list. You know, they work with their administration to come up with a budget. But Congress is saying, okay, tell us what else you want. And they are required to do so, although under the Biden administration, some chose not to. But there is a proposal to end that, and that would be a great idea. There's something called the Ethics Act that would stop Congress from investing in stocks altogether, and that would include Pentagon corporations. And in general, we could increase taxes on big corporations. So if you sign up at www.chn.org, you can keep posted on the kinds of issues we're talking about, have the opportunity to join in calling for very specific things that will address this need versus greed imbalance. So thank you very much. That's an example. If you click right now, you'll be able to tell Congress we need to go back to expanding the child tax credit. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Taxing corporations, perhaps the rich. What a good idea. I think that's wonderful. So much appreciated. Our next panelist is David Boris, and he is talking about the releasing of tens of billions of dollars if the Sentinel ICBM replacement contracts were canceled. David?
Thanks. Thank you all. Thank you so much for asking me to participate in this discussion with such esteemed panelists as Bianca Singh, Deborah Weinstein, and Mary Najimi. Back in January of this year, Jonathan King asked if I could take part in their annual conference and speak to, quote, the folly of buying and building a new generation of ICBMs. And I thought then the natural place to start was with the Webster definition of folly, which is 1, lack of good sense or normal prudence and forethought, and 2, criminally or tragically foolish actions or conduct. Over the course of the past 10 months and in preparation to speak with you all this afternoon, I've come to realize that folly is an inadequate term to describe the madness of engaging in what is rapidly becoming an all-out, hell-bent for leather, now trilateral new nuclear arms race. It's difficult to find the language to adequately describe this behavior, but I think now that lunacy is a better description for this blind, and forgive me for being crudely blunt, moronic path on which we find ourselves now embarked. Allow me, please, to take a short step back to just a little more than 3 years ago. On Friday, January 22nd, 2021, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, having obtained the requisite 50 states parties' ratifications, came into force as international law. There was great hope then that this could be the catalyst to move us beyond static arms control treaties and perhaps establish momentum for an ultimate path to zero. Lending credence to this hope was that our newly elected president, Joe Biden, was on record more than a few times during the campaign stating that he would make a formal no first use declaration that could perhaps be a tiny first step toward achieving his predecessor's famous 2009 declaration in Prague. Quote, I state clearly and with conviction, America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons, Barack Obama said on that day. Such great hope. And the first step toward such a comprehensive plan, well, that appeared obvious. Of the three legs of the US and Russia's nuclear triad, all experts, and I really do mean all experts in nuclear weapons policy, agree that the most dangerous and unstable leg of the three, land, sea, and air, are fixed in place land-based ICBMs. They are, by their very fixed in place status, completely vulnerable to a preemptive first strike. So vulnerable that they're often referred to in nuclear policy circles as a sponge that would absorb an enemy's first strike. Of course, the illogic or lunacy of that is that if you wanted to have a land-based retaliatory capacity, you would need to launch those missiles between the time of first warning and the moment of impact, about 26 minutes. Given the 10 minutes it takes from receiving the go code to actual launch, plus the 6 minutes it takes to fully verify that they're indeed incoming missiles and not a flock of birds, you're left with about 10 minutes for the United States president, who has sole authority to launch those weapons, to decide, as the term is used, to use them or lose them. And thus, the fate of the world, or at least 90% of the 8 billion souls the planet currently houses, hangs in the balance of those 10 minutes and one human being. What was not fully understood in 1978, when Air Force Chief of Staff General Lou Allen coined the term nuclear sponge, was the concept of nuclear winter, whereupon the 400 to 800 outbound thermonuclear missiles headed for enemy silos would create a firestorm that would blot out 70% of the sunlight reaching the ground on Earth and effectively make it impossible to grow crops for 3 years or more. So those unfortunates who survived the original searing effects of thousands of blasts and the pursuant radiation poisoning would simply die of starvation over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. This led the brilliant scientist and author Carl Sagan to remark of a nuclear exchange, the living will envy the dead. And so the obvious first steps were to, one, eliminate the program scheduled under the Nuclear Modernization Act of 2010 to replace all 400 Minuteman missiles, which comprise our land-based leg of the triad, and two, begin to dismantle the existing land-based leg. And in so doing, send a clear signal to a nervous China or our old nuclear adversary, Russia, that we meant to make good on the spirit of Barack Obama's 2009 Prague speech and begin to inject some mature sanity into the paradigm of arms control. Unfortunately, none of the above has occurred. And we've wasted 3.5 years and further compromised our credibility with the world community regarding our commitment to protect the lives of the world, especially the over 6 billion people who live in nations that do not possess nuclear weapons. And allow me to add that this out-of-control program budget has now ballooned from $65 billion in 2015 to $95 billion in 2020, and is now estimated to cost $141 billion, and there is no guarantee that it will stop there, despite the triggering of the Nunn-McCurdy Act, forcing the Air Force to review the costs, but who have decided to plow ahead just the same. This is just part of the lunacy ramp. Do I have a minute left still?
You have no more minutes, but if you have, you can have 30 seconds at my pleasure.
Over the years, I've heard Daniel Ellsberg say the possibility of a nuclear detonation by design, miscalculation, or accident is not zero. It's not even close to zero. And we know the universal laws of physics and mathematics will tell you that anything that is not impossible is indeed inevitable. Our 75-year history of nuclear weapons possession is replete with example after example of misunderstandings, accidents, and Cold War fear, where we just barely escaped a major exchange of nuclear weapons. By a stroke of luck, or the right person being in position to exercise proper judgment in the moment, or by cooler heads at the top restraining their initial instinct, we've avoided the apocalypse. But that should not and cannot be counted on to last forever. I took my degree from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. I took a variety of courses in mathematics and casino games. I will tell you, I know a little something about winning streaks. They don't last forever. It's a mathematical impossibility. We have been the beneficiaries of a fantastically long winning streak with respect to nuclear weapons. It won't last forever. If we continue to add bullets to the chamber of the revolver we hold to our own heads and to the heads of the world population in this lunatic game of nuclear Russian roulette, our luck will run out and we won't get a second chance to get this right. And that behavior is a marker indicating extreme recklessness and mental illness, the Webster definition of lunacy. Thank you. I look forward to Q&A and all of our continued work to eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. What a frightening and bleak picture we hear you paint of the future, which could become reality. So much appreciated. Our final speaker on this panel is Mary Najimy, and she is going to be speaking about releasing tax dollars by pulling back from Gaza, Ukraine, and other foreign wars. Mary?
Hi, thank you, Carol. It's really lovely to be on this panel with you, and I'm actually so thrilled that an elected official is facilitating this. Do you really understand the critical moment? So I'm going to start in a little bit of an unconventional way. I'm going to start by showing you some infographics. I've been asked to talk about the human and financial costs of war, and I'm focusing mostly on the Palestinians. I want to show you first to understand the price tag. I want you to see what the price tag is paying for. So I'm going to just show you the infographics. I don't feel a need to speak because the information speaks for itself, and it's pretty somber. And I think it requires just some silent reflection on the content. So we're going to first start with the human cost, and then we'll pivot towards the financial cost. And this came, Al Jazeera's just put out a report. I'm going to put all the links in the chat in just a moment. I want to stop there and feel free just to put any reactions that you have in the chat. And I'm still sharing my screen because I want to go back to this idea that 625,000 children enrolled in schools in Gaza have not had access to education in over a year now. I want to put that in context of Massachusetts. We have approximately 915, maybe 20,000 children enrolled in public schools in Massachusetts. 625,000 Gazan children is the equivalent of about 2/3 of children in Massachusetts. And we also have some experience with this. You know, I was the president of the MTA during COVID, and I wouldn't change a thing about how we kept our children safe by keeping our schools closed. But look at the impacts on the children of Gaza. 5 years of loss and potentially a generation of permanently traumatized children. That's almost 1 million people for an entire generation who will be traumatized. So let's take a look at the $33 billion in direct damage caused by Israel's attack. How much of it was actually paid for by the United States? Before we actually get into the price tag of this year, this is a report from the Watson Institution for the International Public Affairs at Brown University. They have a project called The Cost of War. And this just shows you over time how much military aid has gone to Israel. And if you correlate it to the dates, you actually see the peaks in rise of funding were also peaks in armed resistance in the lands of Palestine, you know, in the West Bank and Israel. But if you look at the 17.9 billion, that's off the charts. And that's just 1 year. The same project did a study, and I'm going to put the links to the study in the chat, that they actually calculate, because the cost is unhidden, they actually calculate that it's closer to $23 billion in aid just in this year. And let me stop sharing and let me just tell you a little bit of information from their report. So they say that the U.S. is spending on Israel's military operations and related U.S. operations in the region total at least $22.6 billion. And they say it's conservative. And what they include is the weapons that are going to Israel, but also the figure includes another, you know, which is about 17.9 billion, but that also includes 4.86 billion for operations in the region that also include in Yemen. If you actually go to the Council on Foreign Relations, they have a higher estimate, totaling around 24 billion just this year. And an additionally 500 million a year is slated for Israel and joint U.S.-Israeli missile defense programs, in which the two countries collaborate on research, development, and production of these systems by Israel, including Iron Dome and David Sling and Arrow 2. So let's take a look at how that money can be spent here. You heard everything Max and Jess and our higher ed folks talked about. Let me just put this in context of the Student Opportunity Act. And then if I could take another minute, I'll just talk about what we could do. I was the president, and my first campaign in 2018 was the Student Opportunity Act. We won $1.5 billion in public education to be phased in over 7 years. You heard Max say we're now in year 5, and it's adjusted for inflation. So in 2 years from now, it'll be $2 billion, maybe $2.2 billion. It's taking 7 years to get that money to Massachusetts public schools. It does not take 7 years or 7 months or 7 weeks or 7 days to get money to Israel. It's built into the budget, $3 billion a year. And now we've seen $22 billion just in this past year. So what do we have to do? We're in the moment where there's the largest anti-war movement in this country, well, the largest justice for Palestine movement in this country and around the world with more participation by organized labor than I've ever seen in my life. I started MTA rank and file for Palestine, and we're doing work to push the MTA, to push the NEA successfully to take positions on protecting academic freedom and divesting our pensions. That's a movement that's growing. The BDS movement has met with incredible success. We have opportunities now to push at our local and our state levels. Just one example, and I'll finish, and then maybe we can have more of a conversation. But you have mass peace action all over Massachusetts and all over the country. In Massachusetts, we have Massachusetts for Palestine, a very robust network of town by town activists who are doing Justice for Palestine work. Imagine the power we can harness if we push our local city councils, our town councils, our elected officials to divest any holdings that the cities or the towns have, any pensions. It's a moment that requires urgent action, escalated action in a way that we've never seen before, because the immediate call from the movement now is an arms embargo. And that will actually stop all the violence so that we can get to a just and permanent solution. So I will stop there.
Oh, thank you very, very much for that information. Very sobering to say. Okay. Jonathan, how much time should we allow for Q&A? A few, none, some?
We got the break is scheduled at 3:30, so we got, past. We're at break time.
We are at break time, so I just want to thank all the panelists. I have always enjoyed facilitating and as I said earlier, hearing what folks have to say and what our agenda will be as a next step. Those are the
So please take 5 minutes for whatever you need to do and come back at 3:40, and we'll move to panel 3 on what's actually happening on the ground here in this country. Thank you. All right, folks, I'm sure it's too short a break for most of you, but some of you are back. And our third panel, we're happy to have Shailly Gupta Barnes, the policy director of the Cairo Center in New York City and the policy director for the National Poor People's Campaign and lead author of many important studies such as the Moral Budget for America. Shailly, I don't know, are you here? Yes, there you are. Very good. All right, you're in the driver's seat.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone, for being here for this important set of conversations. I've been working at the intersection of poverty and systemic racism and militarism and organizing and research for nearly 20 years. So my heart's already part of this conversation, but I also have three children in the public school system in New York City, in elementary, middle, and high school. And we're just facing all kinds of cuts. And this is in a democratically led city, in a democratically led state, where, also in upstate New York, I've been working with one of these community schools up there, which relies on all kinds of public funding to provide, poor and low income kids in a massive rural county, everything they need. And they're working really hard to figure things out. And if and when these budgets are cut, the whole district will suffer the consequences, but it will fall hardest on the county's poorest residents. And meanwhile, New York is the kind of state that hasn't raised its taxes on its wealthiest citizens. I think we have over 100 billionaires, and we're losing millions of dollars a year that could support public education and all housing programs and so much more. But we're just not keeping up with the needs of our communities, right? Instead, as we know, all of this resources at a state and a federal level is going to military spending, is going to war, is going to support, this genocide in Gaza, where this Israeli bombardment has destroyed 90% of the, public school buildings there. And we are now just days away from another consequential election. We have the drumbeats of war sounding louder than ever. And education should really be at the forefront of our minds because we have really at stake this all-out fight for our future. And so I'm really, honored to facilitate this panel discussion today on public education and local politics, because whatever happens in November, the consequences will be borne out at a local level in our districts and counties and states and regions. And I think our panelists have something really important to say about all of this. And so I will give a very brief introduction to all four of our panelists, and then a little bit more thorough introduction as each person comes on to share some comments. And then everyone will have some time for questions after the individual panelist comments. Then we'll come together at the end of the hour for our collective conversation. So with us this afternoon, we have Ricardo Rosa for the Massachusetts Teachers Association. He'll be speaking on getting out the public education vote in November. We also have Reverend Savina Martin from the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign. He'll be speaking on mobilizing low income and low frequency voters. We have Edith Bazile, founder of the Black Advocates for Educational Excellence, who'll speak with us around the continuing struggle for equal access to quality public education, and Douglas Selwyn, professor of education at Antioch University, who'll speak about the right-wing efforts to suppress truthful curriculums across the nation. So welcome to all of you. And, I believe, Mr. Rosa, you'll be starting us off this afternoon. Ricardo Rosa is formerly faculty at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, as the Director of Training and Professional Learning for the Massachusetts Teachers Education, and a leader in the successful effort to limit charter schools expansion in southeastern Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a great honor to be on a panel of distinguished folks here who I've admired, for many years. It's also sobering, to be in a space where, we're talking about these issues, and it's quite clear that the understanding is that we don't only live in a country, but we actually live in an empire, and all of this is related. So, I was so inspired by some of the things that I've heard here. I want to say a few things about education broadly, if I could, and then discuss the importance of the Yes on Question 2 campaign. Of course, much of what I have to say about education broadly is totally related to the issue of funding, right? I remember a while back, driving through the city of Brockton, Massachusetts, and seeing a sign that read, "Education makes America work," the United States is the only industrialized nation where property taxes play a central role, right, in school funding, which guarantees inequality between school districts and between schools in the same district, right? We place the most experienced educators in the schools with the highest concentrations of poverty. Black and brown students and immigrant students predominantly make up the population of those schools, right? I once read, I forget where, about a social studies educator, right, who related how, he was teaching a lesson on Brown versus Board of Education to his 11th grade history class, right? And the lesson was simply genius, right? And there were plenty of opportunities for students to articulate their experiences, but at the end of the lesson, right, the educator asked students to reflect on what it all meant, right? And one student looked around the classroom and responded, "Well, it means that this class right here, right, this very classroom is illegal, right? It's a crime," right? We live in a space where, special education students are routinely denied specific services outlined in their individualized education plan, right? Often the intensity and frequency of the services are lacking. Staff often lack the necessary qualifications. There's often an over-reliance, right, on generic solutions, right, in special education. Access to publicly funded and imparted quality early childhood education programs is often limited for families living in poverty. You have disproportionate disciplinary measures such as suspensions and expulsions, right, often affecting students of color and those with disabilities, leading to higher dropout rates. They're actually pushed out rates if we look at it, right? Language matters, right? When we look at what's going on and truly examine patterns, you realize that it's not dropout, but it's actually pushed out rates, right? Emergent bilingual and multilingual learners lack the support they need, impacting their ability to succeed academically. The very fact, right, that we place them in a category called ELL, right, or English language learners, right, says it all. I mean, their entire existence in schools is focused on English language acquisition as if that's the totality, right, of their being, right? And so I reflect back to the sign that I just talked about. Education makes America work. And what I have to ask is, for which America does education work, right? This is a conference that's focused on education at the federal level. So for what it's worth, I mean, just offer a few of the things that I think we might think about, right? And some things have been stated. I think one is the guarantee, right? To guarantee the right to a quality free pre-K through 16 public education for all through a constitutional amendment, a federal constitutional amendment, right? Two, we need to support the expansion of full service community schools and eventually make every school a community school. And one of the ways that we can do, I mean, there's multiple ways we can do it. I mean, there's the funds that currently exist in school districts can be reappropriated, right, into the full service community school strategy. We can divert funds from police department budgets, and many of our guests today spoke about some brilliant ways to divert funds, right? We should institute an equitable national school funding formula that's based upon need rather than local property tax revenue. Four, I think we should divert federal funding for the military, weapons, and nuclear industry to funding for public education and end contracts between the U.S. military and public education. Institute equitable funding for ecologically sound school building infrastructure that ensures safe and humane conditions for students and staff. And I think we should implement a reciprocal accountability framework that holds policymakers and state and federal legislators responsible for providing the necessary resources and supports to ensure high-need schools succeed, right? I think just two more areas that I think we could focus on is one, requiring informed parental guardian consent forms for children to be subjected to standardized testing or military recruitment in schools, right? And last, I think we should end, test-based evaluation of teachers and teacher preparation programs, right? These are just some of the areas that I was thinking about as folks were speaking. Some of the areas that we should just give some thought to. So now I'll turn it over to getting out the public education vote in the Yes on Question 2 campaign. First of all, I want to salute, all those on the Zoom who have been struggling for years, to end the use of high-stakes tests in our schools. One of the reasons why I've worked to resist high-stakes testing is that it's connected to broader struggles. For me, it's never been just about testing. A lot of these issues are so connected, right? A great deal of what's been spoken about here today, right, centers on the abusive and exploitative realities embedded in capitalism, right? The struggle against high-stakes testing, for me, is an anti-capitalist struggle, right? Standardized testing is about disguising class, right, as personal merit. That's basically what it's about. And the only people who say that there's a benefit, from the test are those who benefit from it, right? A question that I sometimes hear, as I go around canvassing and phone banking is, what's the alternative, right? And I always approach this question with a counter question, right? Can you imagine anything else other than having a corporation hand you a test and say, just implement it, right? And we already know that there are alternatives. The alternatives exist. The consortium schools in New York, for example, is a powerful example. Michelle Fine has studied them and documented the power of portfolios, which document learning through multiple artifacts, students taking control of their learning, and the focus is on the process of meaning making, right? The difference, I mean, the reason why it's so hard for us to wrap our minds around, these types of alternatives is because of the issue of efficiency, right? We want something that's efficient. The managerial class likes to implement things that are efficient and also things that are not as costly, right? I mean, we have no problem, sending billions of funds to war, as has been mentioned here today, but constantly cut corners, right, on the social good, on programs for the social good. So these are just some things. I think we should also support, right, every effort to dismantle the high stakes associated with the MCAS. Every effort is an effort to reclaim stolen education, right? So time spent on test prep could be spent assessing social and economic problems in the community and working with students to devise solutions and intervene with concrete action to ameliorate things in their community. So some of the things we're finding as we're canvassing and speaking to voters is that voters trust educators. So if you're an educator, please get out there. I have also found that it's powerful to hear from friends. So speak to friends and family about the Yes on Question 2 campaign. And I'm going to share a link on the chat for folks to to come and join canvassing and join phone banking across the state, and just to get involved. And I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry that it took me a little while to get to the getting out the vote part, which is what I was invited to do in this conference. But the conference has been very inspiring, and I just wanted to say some other things. Thank you so much, Shailly.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is a very thoughtful opening to this part of the conversation on education and power and politics and how we can move our priorities at the state and federal level to be what we need them to be, right? And so I think we probably have time for maybe one question before we move on to our next panelist. Anyone has a question, you can put in the chat or raise your hand, your virtual hand.
Sheila has a question.
Great. Sheila, please go ahead. Oh, Sheila, I believe you're on mute.
Yeah. Am I supposed to just discuss what he was talking about or the last panelist?
We're now focused on this. If you could focus your comment or question on
right.
Yeah.
I think you did. I think you skipped over our ability to respond to the last panelist. I put my hand up. Yeah, I know you didn't mean to, but we came back from the break. I was ready. I had my hand up, and then we didn't get to talk.
Because the speakers used up all the time, and there was no time for questions.
Well, I know, but
So perhaps, yeah, I mean, perhaps we can move on to our next panelist, and hopefully at the end of this conversation, maybe there can be time for broader comment. So
thank you.
Well, let me invite now Reverend Savina Martin to chime in. Savina is from Roxbury, Massachusetts, a mother, sister, aunt, military veteran, lifelong moral leader who was radicalized during the 1968 urban uprisings. Her decades of organizing began with the historic National Union of the Homeless housing takeover movement in 1986. And her ministry is dedicated to the struggles for the human right to house everyone, everywhere. She's a people's minister and organizes with the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign and is completing her seminarian degree at Boston University School of Theology. And so thank you, Reverend Savina.
Well, thank you so much, Shailly, and to MAPA, longtime partners, and especially Jonathan King, who I've known for a good part of 30, almost 40 years. So thank you so much. As the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign continues to partner alongside of this important topic in building peace. So let's go back to the last election on the heels of our last speaker, right? The last presidential election, from what we were told, were probably about, 22 to 26 debates, and not 1 hour was spent on the poor, on centering the poor and dispossessed within that discussion, right? So what are we doing with the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign? We are talking to each other. We're building a movement from the bottom up. So again, thank you for inviting us here. In this final stage of our Get Out the Vote program, we're using every tool at our disposal to wake up the sleeping giant of poor and low infrequent voters, including protecting voters' rights at the poll. And in every state across the nation, if you experience any form of voter intimidation, misinformation, or problem while voting, we're telling people to make sure to contact the National Voter Hotline. Closer to home, did you know that the poor are a powerful force in this country? And if poor and low-income eligible voters went to the polls at the same rate as higher income voters, they would have the power to sway election outcomes in every state. I think we all know that, because we are the swing vote. The Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign has mobilized organizers to hit the streets at the top of this year as we launched with over 32 state campaigns. It's simultaneous, coordinated 40 weeks of Get Out the Vote campaign. So today, we are still taking action together. We're canvassing in low-wage communities, we're text banking, we have trainings, we're reaching and teaching and speaking to low and frequent voters across the state and in low infrequent voter zip codes. Churches have been partnering with us, storefronts, community, neighborhood churches, organizations have partnered with us to get out the vote season. For example, as I mentioned in the beginning that no one speaks to us, we were organizing and canvassing in the Mattapan area of Boston. We had two people that went along with our canvassing. One was a Globe reporter, a Boston Globe reporter that followed along with us, and the other was an international reporter from Pakistan. By the end of our canvassing, he said, you know what? He said, I've been working on campaigns since 2008, and I never talked to poor people. So across Massachusetts, there are 1.3 low and frequent voters impacted by poverty, racism, food insecurity, non-affordable housing, homelessness, the proliferation of gun violence, and mass incarceration. All of these are enmeshed in the 5 interlocking injustices of militarism, poverty, racism, the distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism, and ecological devastation / the denial of healthcare. So we have been out voting, and I'm going to show you exactly what we're doing. I'm going to show you a slide. I can show you better than I can tell you something. Let me show you a slide if I can just share my screen for a second. I'm going to show you what we've been doing out in the streets. Here we go. So here we are. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So here's our Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign, Get Out the Vote campaign. All across the nation and including Massachusetts. We launched our Friday through Sunday and all through the month canvassing in different neighborhoods that show up on that heat map with the zip code. We've gone all across the state. We've held canvassing educationals, and this was in Mattapan at the Church of the Holy Spirit, where we held, an early morning canvassing training, and then we hit the streets. We have tons of voter information that we're passing out to low and infrequent voters. Here's one of the churches in Mattapan that reached out to us, and we went in. Oh, we had our network from the Episcopalian Church that mobilizes across the state in the Episcopal Diocese. They were with us along with the reporters that day. I don't know why I might just admit this. Okay, it's not going any further. Cole?
Yes, Savina, I don't know how to make your
There we
site
go.
advance.
Yeah, something happened there. Okay, let me go through this quickly. This is in Holyoke, Massachusetts, one of our low and infrequent heat map voting areas. where our poor and dispossessed siblings came out that day. We have folks from Worcester, Mass. We have Springfield, Mass. All of us are there standing and speaking. We have Judy, who is saying, no one speaks to us, no one talks to us, but we are the swing vote. And she's giving her testimony. And here we are that day, at the end of the day in Mattapan. This is one of our organizers, Meredith. She lives in Great Barrington. Here are our folks in Dorchester, Massachusetts, just last week, the neighborhood church canvassing that 1 mile area. Here we are downtown Boston. As you can see, there's Dean Amy from the Episcopal Cathedral with us canvassing. Here we are speaking to the unhoused in the community who are being impacted, not being able to afford homes. And we're passing out different flyers and information to them. And here we are, because of food insecurity, we partnered with fresh food trucks. You can see in the background, just yesterday, folks were out canvassing, and as you can see, passing out the information. We even marched in a parade in Somerville, and here we are talking about, you know, fight poverty, not the poor, and why we are the swing vote. And so that's a little bit about what we're doing and what we've done, and what we'll continue to do up until we complete these next text-baking rounds, and also invite folks to come to the polls. Even if people need a ride to the polls, we are definitely going to march and sing our way to the polls and fight this system to dismantle all of these injustices that impact us around voter suppression, gerrymandering, and not having a right to speak by casting our votes. That's all I have right now. Yeah, a little bit more, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Reverend Sabina, both for the work you've been doing for decades, but also this work of not only making poverty visible in the state of Massachusetts, but the power of the poor visible, felt, seen, heard all across the state and across the country. And if people aren't familiar, the agenda of the Poor People's Campaign does include a robust set of demands around equitable, diverse, culturally appropriate, and fully funded public education, very much in line with the set of demands that Ricardo laid out for us earlier. So yeah, people should see that we are all calling for similar needs, because that's who we're connected to. So let me pause for a minute. Actually, perhaps in the interest of time, I might move to our third panelist, Edith Bazile, who's the former president of Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts and the past education co-chair of the NAACP. Edith is a founder of Black Advocates for Educational Excellence and advocates for educational equity, social justice, restorative justice, and dismantling oppressive educational systems, structures, policies, and practices. Thank you so much, Edith, for being here and for joining this conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Shailly. And thank you so much, Jonathan, for inviting me. Hello, everyone. And I love having this conversation. Anyone who knows me knows that I love history. And so as we talk about, I was asked to talk about the continuing struggle of equal access to quality public education. And of course, in order to do that, it's important to look back and interrogate the birth of American educational systems and its continuing impact. And so I'm going to start off with the words of Dr. Martin Luther King by saying, "We are here to dramatize a shameful condition." I'm from Massachusetts, born and raised in Boston. I spent 32 years teaching in Boston public schools. Massachusetts is the first northern colony to legalize slavery. The legacy of slavery in Massachusetts was one of stripping Black people's genealogical knowledge, country of origin, language, traditions, heritage, and cultural practices through separating and selling family members, including children, to erase the transmission of intrinsic cultural knowledge across generations. It's important for us to go back to that. Literacy was banned to break the spirit of Black people, create total dependence, and squash the hope of freedom. Still, Black people found ways to resist and secretly learn to read. When public education was founded right here in Boston, Massachusetts in 1635, Black people were enslaved in Massachusetts for a nearly 145 years. When freed, formal education was denied. So Black people in Boston built freedom schools. The first was in Beacon Hill area in 1798. During Reconstruction, Black people built Black schools all over the country, including 100 boarding schools, and achieved significant progress in closing Black literacy gaps. However, I have to talk about this history. Our own Harvard University has a deep history in the slave trade and the eugenics movement that resulted in 60,000 involuntary sterilizations in 1970. Boston public schools are named after Harvard eugenicists, like the Oliver Wendell Holmes, Harvard law professor and dean, who said sterilization was necessary to, quote, prevent our being swamped with incompetence, end of quote. Joseph Lee, another school, a Harvard JD, who served on the Boston School Committee and funded the eugenics movement. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the second Black Harvard PhD, left his teaching position when the university rejected his petition to teach Black history. Dr. Woodson went on to become the father of Black history and founder of Black History Month. Black civil rights lawyers could not predict the racist backlash of the 1954 Brown decision that shut down Black teacher unions, closed Black schools, and bussed Black students into racist hellholes. White teacher unions did not protect Black teachers' employment rights, and over 38,000 Black teachers lost their jobs in the South alone. 50 years after a Boston court order could not force Boston public schools to hire and retain Black teachers. Black Boston public schools graduates like myself were told we were not college material. Yet we fought to dedicate our lives to transform a system committed to perpetuating educational apartheid. Black students should not have to be unfairly resilient against school policies and practices rooted in colonial remnants of educational apartheid that perpetuate educational gaps. But I have to say that both the MCAS and NAEP are like X-rays. X-rays don't create gaps, they expose them. They reveal the racial inequity in education. Imagine your school assignment algorithm trapped you in an underperforming school. Each morning you enter a crumbling infrastructure with no library, science lab, cafeteria, or gymnasium. If you have reading challenges or mental health issues, you most likely will end up in a segregated special education program and not receive services. You'll get no reading support, no opportunity for advanced courses, world languages, early college, or internships. You are greeted with metal detectors, over-surveilled with cameras, safety officers, and subject to random searches. You're sent to the timeout room and disproportionately subject to suspensions, expulsions, and detentions, and pushed into the school to prison pipeline. You have to take the same test as your privileged students who are clustered into high-achieving, state-of-the-art, cutting-edge facilities with rich technology, rooftop classrooms, and amphitheaters to catalyze their learning. These are not gaps. These are school policy decisions. James Baldwin said, "If one really wishes to know how justice is administered, one does not question the protected members," end of quote. Racial equity in schools will not be achieved without the leadership of Black educators, because the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house or bring about genuine change. We know that since desegregation, Black educators have been pushed out of schools and not retained. Achieving racial equity cannot be captured with a single story. To achieve educational renewal, we must address the roots of racism throughout the entire forest, not just the decay of trees. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith, for this history and for connecting that to the situation we're facing today. One of my mentors said many years ago, you know, history is the rock we stand on, right? And so it's from that perspective that we can appreciate, understand where we are right now and what then will move us forward. So thank you for making those connections. I wanted to invite, I believe, Cole, this panel wraps at 4:30. Is that correct?
Supposed to be 4:20.
4:20. Okay, so I'm going to move right into Douglas Selwyn. So Douglas taught in the Seattle Public Schools for more than 15 years. He's currently a professor of education at Antioch University and writes regularly on the issues of public education for newspapers and other media outlets. So thank you, Douglas, for joining us and rounding out our panel this afternoon.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's just a real pleasure and difficult to hear the stories that have filled the afternoon. I did want to say I actually retired from teaching in upstate New York, and I wanted to add to what you said at the beginning. One of the chief ways that funding happens in upstate New York is through prisons. So this is just the military. The prisons are major economic drivers up in upstate New York, which is another horrifying aspect. I want to, I guess, sort of echo what previous panelists have talked about. My task is to talk about what's going on currently in terms of the right-wing attacking and narrowing curriculum, but I think we can't do that without doing some history. And the context is that schools are actually doing what many people would say, and I would agree with them, what they're designed to do, which is to separate and sort and carry out a real eugenics agenda that was set around the turn of the 1900s. The eugenics folks identified what they said were superior and inferior groups, and the people who were included in the inferior groups were people of color, especially and immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were coming over to this country in great numbers at that time. African Americans who were coming up from the South, looking for working factories. Those folks were all labeled as inferior, and the eugenicists developed tests to prove it. Well, those are the same groups that are being failed by the current testing again. And so it's hard to argue or to at least not have the suspicion that the testing that we are carrying out in our schools are doing what they were designed to do, with certain groups coming out on top and certain groups being punished, I guess, for the inequality and racism of the country in that sense. And what I think is most important is when we think about what's going on now, you don't treat it as something that is unique, but it's something that's gone on through our whole history. So there are things that are happening, and I'll talk about those in a minute, but recognizing that there has been book banning throughout our history. There have been narrowing of curriculum, starting with the curriculum at the very beginning of Massachusetts schools, under the old Deluder law, which was teaching the Bible so that white kids could resist the temptations of Satan by being able to read the Bible. Horace Mann, the father of public education, part of his agenda was to make sure that the poor didn't revolt. And that was part of why we had public education. You know, the eugenicists, et cetera, have already talked about briefly. In the mid-1960s, there was sort of a push for child-centered education, which threatened the administration no end. And one of the members of the Trilateral Commission in the mid-70s wrote about the dangers of an excess of democracy. He said it was really much harder to sort of be appreciated on the world stage and to make the living if all those groups who were now wanting to be at the table and be involved were allowed to be involved. So he really railed against it. He said in the good old days, it was just a few, business leaders and bankers who would help presidents make decisions. But now all these people of color and women and other people said, us too, And that makes it look bad and makes it messy. And that kind of feedback of actually a children-centered education led to a back to basics movement. And the back to basics movement narrowed the curriculum. We'll tell you what to learn and how to learn it and how to spit back what you've been taught. And enough of this learning what matters to you, enough of this learning about what's going on in the country. We can't have a nation at risk to push that even further. And No Child Left Behind in 2002 took it up a notch because the pressure of meeting the high stakes testing that Ricardo was talking about earlier, cast in our state, meant that there wasn't time to actually take a look at the larger issues. There wasn't time to focus on the questions and concerns and what's happening in your community that we have to keep the test. It also very much narrowed the teaching pool, right? Because a lot of people who would be incredible teachers and incredible mentors to our kids either were shut out by the testing process itself, or took one look at what was happening in the schools and said, I don't want to do that to other kids. So there were a whole lot of creative educators, educators of color, educators who had a much broader sense of what justice and equity looked like, were frozen out or chosen out of being part of
Sorry, Doug, you got a little garbled.
Sorry about that.
Just
I
want to
will
make
try
sure
to talk a
people-
little more into the microphone, but also to
That's
speed
much
up.
better. Yes.
Okay, good. So what's happening today? Well, it's an extension of what's been happening for 250 years. Most particularly, there are more than 44 states where legislation has been introduced to prohibit the actual accurate teaching of history. In Arizona, Florida, and Indiana, students have to seek permission from parents before being taught about human sexuality. And so no sex education in those states, no abortion. That's not a good combination, I think. There's a Republican who has introduced in South Carolina a bill that said schools should make clear that the American judicial system is based on equality under the law rather than equity of outcomes. There are legislative agendas to prohibit DEI, to ban books, well, you know the list. I don't have to go through the list of what's been done. What's important is to recognize that it's happening currently. The Project 2025 outlines it in greater detail about what's going to happen to public schools. We know that testing and attack on public schools is going to be ratcheted up. And in at least 10 states, legislators have proposed bills and require administrators to list every book, reading, and activity that teachers use in their lessons. I mean, it's pretty stunning the degree to which they will go in this attack on our children. Right? And our children are the role of education, the function of education is to prepare young society to move into the roles of responsibility and leadership as they grow older. And if you rob them of their education and their history and prevent them from actually gaining the skills and practices that would allow them to function, you're not only hurting them, you're hurting all of us. That seems to be what's happening. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, for your comments and just kind of reminding us what's at stake. What's at stake right now, what's at stake in these next couple of weeks, and what we need to be thinking about even past November, as so much of this is unfolding at the state level, regardless of what happens in the elections. In a couple of weeks, the consequences of these attacks on education will continue and affect the next generation of young leaders that we so desperately need. Just based on the so I wanted to double check on
Yeah,
time.
no, I think we have to move to our
I-
final panel. Thank you so much, Shailly, and all the speakers. Cole Harrison, the administrative director of Peace Action and one of the leaders of the Israel-Gaza effort, is going to be our chair. And Cole, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome to the panel on Battleground elections. We have 3 speakers to share. The first is Alexandra Rathman-Noonan. Let's see, I'm just spotlighting people and talking at the same time. She's Director of School Support for the New York Performance Standards Consortium. She worked as a high school science teacher, a school leader in New York City schools, and supported schools within the New York City Department of Education. Kathy Greeley of Cambridge Retired Educators United will speak on the Massachusetts high-stakes referendum. Question 2 on the November ballot. She taught in Cambridge and Boston schools for 37 years and is author of Testing Education, a Teacher's Memoir, published by UMass Press in April. And Larry Cohen, National Chair of Our Revolution, is former president of Communication Workers of America and was a key advisor in the Bernie Sanders for President campaigns. He will speak on federal battleground elections. Each of our panelists will speak for 6 minutes, and then we hope we will have time for questions. Alexandra, over to you.
Thanks so much, Cole. I'm going to share my screen.
Go for it.
So, well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm very honored to be here. Also, thank you to Dr. Rosa for the lovely shout out. So I work with the New York Performance Standards Consortium. We are a New York State-based organization, and I think I'm here today to talk a little bit about our experience of grassroots advocacy for the type of education policy that supports high-quality schooling. So just a little bit about us. Consortium is a group of 38 public, non-charter schools in New York State. We graduate students without taking the 5 standardized tests in New York City. In New York, we call them Regents exams that are required by all other New York State public schools. We're a diverse group of schools, mostly in New York City, and we reflect the demographics of our community and have a very long history of outperforming similar schools in terms of student outcomes, like graduation rate and college persistence. And it's because of the unique type of education we've been able to sustain despite the very aggressive push over the past 2 decades from the federal and state governments towards standardized testing-driven schools. Over the time of the last 25 years, our schools have built a viable alternative to standardized test-driven school cultures by focusing on understanding what students know and can do by looking at their actual work through a process we call performance-based assessment. We have built a system we call student-focused, teacher-developed, and externally assessed that rests on values of teacher and student voice and choice and community-driven rather than test-based accountability. Our work began many decades ago with visionary educators, including Deborah Meyer, founder of Central Park East Secondary School, who went to the State Commissioner of Education at the time, Tom Sobel, and sought a waiver from the state regents exam requirements for the group of schools that were doing innovative student-centered teaching and learning. Commissioner Sobel granted that waiver and allowed these schools to award what in New York State we call regents diplomas via a portfolio of 4 performance-based assessment tasks. However, almost immediately after this happened, there was a change in leadership at the state level that coincided with the education policy pendulum swing towards standardized test-based accountability, and the consortium schools were almost immediately told that they had to shift to a test-based system. Which is, I think, why I'm speaking today, is that the hopeful part of our story begins now. And that is one that shows the power of grassroots organizing, community-based coalitions of families, teachers, and students, and that, in fact, we do have the power to resist bad education policy, including the over-reliance on standardized testing, and to build the type of schools our young people deserve. So over the next 5 years, and this was in the early 2000s, the consortium schools organized letter writing, marches, lobbying efforts, and a lawsuit. And through this unrelenting pressure, we're ultimately successful in having our waiver restored, which has now allowed for a 20-year state-sanctioned experiment in student-centered public schooling to flourish. And we are very glad that the pendulum has started to swing back towards a more appropriate approach to assessment once we as a country had seen how damaging an over-reliance on standardized testing has been. And we are very hopeful that both the state of New York and the other only 8 remaining states in this country that require high-stakes testing for graduation will soon end that practice. And at the next reauthorization of ESSA, the law formerly known as No Child Left Behind, that in that next reauthorization, the federal government can create more flexibility for schools like ours to thrive. And I encourage all of you to join us in our work of showing policymakers and others that a different type of school, one that truly values students' minds and voices, is possible, and that education policy at the state and federal levels needs to support this. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Next up, we have Kathy Greeley. Kathy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I love hearing about what the consortium has done, and I wish I could spend my time talking about how effective working with portfolios was for myself in my own classroom here in Cambridge, Mass. But that isn't my job to do at the moment. And I will jump on the segue that Alexandra gave me, that there are only 8 states left in the country that rely on using standardized tests as a graduation requirement. And sadly, Massachusetts is one of them. You may, as I think people know, sorry, that just one second. People know that we're running a campaign on its question 2 to eliminate the MCAS as a high school graduation requirement. There was a lot of discussion about wanting to go further than that, and many of us, including myself, would love to go further than that, but we decided that this was a very good place to begin. I want to just, some people have said, why are you running a referendum campaign around this? And I think it's important for the public to know that since the MCAS was implemented, the Mass Comprehensive Assessment System in 1998, parents and teachers and other people in our community have been working to change it, to modify it, to bring in a different kind of assessment system than what we've had. And unfortunately, the state legislature and the Department of Education, or DESE that we call it now, have rejected every single effort we have made in the last 20 years to really try to reshape this approach to education. So after, even in just the last year, we had legislation called the Thrive Act at the State House, and it was blocked and voted down by a handful of people who have that kind of power in our State House. So the Mass Teachers Association, along with actually a parent who on her own decided we have to fight this, they came together to launch this referendum campaign to end the MCAS use for high school graduation. It does not end the MCAS as an assessment tool. It will mean all students still take the MCAS, but it will no longer deny the thousands of students who have been denied a high school diploma. So lately, I want to make an appeal to people. We have 10 more days before the election. And as you know, many people have already voted or are voting. So there is a real urgency to this. I found out yesterday that in just the last week, people on the no side of the referendum campaign have raised $1.6 million to try to counter our very grassroots campaign of going door to door, of teachers talking to parents, of parents talking to parents, of people across the state pounding the pavement, of making phone calls. But we don't have those big bucks. So these 1.6 million was donated to do an intensive media campaign. And as I can see Doug telling me, I know that in addition to that 1.6 million, Michael Bloomberg, not a Massachusetts resident, just donated $2.5 million to support the No on 2 campaign. So I think it's really important when we're looking at issues to follow the money and to think about where is this why are these people coming out? They're scared and they want to maintain a certain kind of corporate approach to assessing children. As a friend said to me today, business people really don't know anything about how young children learn or how young children's minds work or how to be a teacher. So I am asking people if you can please get involved in the next 10 days. I think, and I'll put it in the chat again, both Max and Ricardo, and I put it in earlier. You can go to the, I think it's the yes on, I'll put it in the chat, but it's a yes on yes on questions to question2ma.com. And you can sign up for a Canvas or phone banking. But even more effective than that is if you can talk to people you know. If you can talk to, send out an email of all of your friends. If you can call your family. If you can ask your friends to talk to 10 other people. This is, I think, the way we are going to win this campaign. And again, I really appreciated Edith's comments and Ricardo's comments that we need to have a kind of assessment system in our state that really raises and meets the needs of all our children. So
Kathy, you are at time.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And last but not least, we have Larry Cohen. Larry.
There we go. Unmuted. Sound okay?
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, good. So great to be at the end of this great day with great people. Whenever I speak to a group like this one coming out of the peace movement, even though it was your predecessors, because I'm older now myself, but as a young activist, it was the antecedents of groups like Peace Action that were there when I was in a lot of good trouble, as we would say, in Philadelphia, fighting a fascist mayor. And I'm glad to see the word fascist has now made it into the everyday language, thanks to Kamala Harris. I was not glad to see that in a national poll, 8% of the people who agreed that Trump was a fascist said we're voting for him. So, okay, let me get on the subject that I was asked to speak on. So, well, let me first say that as 10 years as the national president of the Communication Workers Union, I would always say, even then, and that ended in 2015, as you heard before, I volunteered and helped lead the Bernie campaign. I would always say it's hard, but not hopeless. So it's been a long day for people. And for those who are still on all day, if there's nothing else from my 5 minutes that's left here, it's hard, it's not hopeless. If I ever come across that it's hopeless, I don't believe that it's hopeless. But the federal situation, which is to those of us focused on nuclear weapons, the military budget, obviously that's a federal appropriation. That's the House, the Senate, and the White House. My assessment of this is, which is not unique, is there's probably one chance in 4 at most that we will have a trifecta again after this election. And sadly, none of the data that I see, directly, the public data or the not public data is very good on that score. Whether it's the White House, the Senate, or the House, we're underwater in all 3. So again, I don't think in the remaining 10 days, those of us on this call, I'm doing my part, by the way, to volunteer like everybody else in our revolution. I don't want to say we shouldn't do that. We should. The more targeted, the better. I'm focused back on Philadelphia and on targeted lists there of people that I'm calling and texting, personal texting. But again, it's not hopeless, but it's not where any of us thought it would be. So again, if our core issue is peace, ending the new round of some $3 trillion round of nuclear weapons, while on the one hand, the work we heard today at the municipal level, at the state level, vote yes on 2, that is the most hopeful work in this election. And there's examples like that all over the country. And so we shouldn't lose track of that. But on the other hand, the federal situation, I don't think any of us believed, I didn't believe that a simple Democratic majority in the House of Representatives was going to be this hard to reach. And for me, and I would argue for most of us, if we dove into it, the key isn't even this election now on the federal level. It's the Democratic primaries in the House of Representatives. That's where we build our base. For our revolution, for me, decades of work on this, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which Bernie started 50 years ago, now has 100 members. That's the most hopeful thing. To be realistic, 50 of them are kind of progressive, where they would vote for an alternative, a drastically reduced military budget. The path to increase that group is in the primaries. The problem that we face in those primaries after this election, which me and many others are going to focus on, is the dark money in the Democratic primaries. It was the worst this year ever. And it was not just AIPAC. They get too much credit. The crypto money, which is going to be absolutely decisive in the federal election in 10 days, is worse. Hard to believe, but it's worse. And in the general election, it's going to be, depending on what you count, including the individual billionaires, it's going to be north of $300 million, just the crypto money. And one key Senate race that I'm involved in, that we all would care about, Sherrod Brown in Ohio. Right now, the crypto money alone, this is not other, McConnell dark money. The crypto dark money alone is about $3 million a day in negative ads that are absolute total lies about Sherrod Brown. And so I like to say, and again, I'm shortening this because people have questions about this whole panel. It's the rules, not just the rulers. And the starting point has got to be, again, whether it's AIPAC, whether it's crypto, the dark, dirty, disgusting, all D's, money in Democratic primaries that prevents us from having the champions we need in that progressive caucus. And that progressive caucus, again, that half of them are outliers and need to be, strong-armed to vote the right way on these budget items. But nonetheless, it's close to half the Democratic caucus. And if you have half the Democratic caucus, you will control, particularly if the Democrats are in the majority, you will control the agenda for the House of Representatives. So there is a path. But the only way we have a path right now is that we need to get the 57 parties, and as Jonathan knows, we've talked about this for several years, Massachusetts is not one of the good ones, to zero down and focus on what can be done about dark, dirty money in Democratic primaries. All Democrats in the House of Representatives, only 2 or 3 would vote right on the issue of the new round of tactical nuclear weapons. Why is that?
Hey,
That's
Larry,
because
you're at
of
time.
the money
Begin to wind
that
down.
they get in the Democratic primaries. More importantly, the challengers are up against that money when they run, whether it's Richard Neal or many others. So, just to sum up, I don't think it's hopeless. I do think we have to focus on state parties and the nominating process and rules in those state parties, that if you run for our nomination, here are the rules. They need to change. That's the path that is not at all hopeless. And then building the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the C3, this Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, which is stronger than it's ever been, but it's not likely to get any stronger after this election because of that dirty money in this year's elections, this year's primaries. I'll stop there.
Larry, we have just a couple minutes. We can take a couple of questions for Alexandra, Kathy, and Larry. Please raise your hand if you have one. Virtual hand is easier to see. Jonathan's got one. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Larry, are there state parties that have a rule that if you're going to run in the primary, you can't access some of that money? I mean, is there a precedent?
No, but again, the more hopeful question would be, are there state parties that are prepared to do that? And that answer is likely yes. States like Oregon and Washington, and Sushila Jayapal's defeat in Portland was, for me, the worst of those primaries this year. And AIPAC was a major force in that, but also crypto. So as a result of that, Oregon, Washington, I think are ready to do something. We're trying to fund a study, and I realize everybody says that, but tied to the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, C3, about what state parties exactly can do. But some of it does come from Massachusetts in 2012. Primary candidates could sign a pledge like the Elizabeth Warren Scott Brown pledge, saying, I repudiate and demand that no dark money be spent on my behalf in this election. That's an easy starting point. None of them even have that.
Thanks. We got a hand from Doug. Go ahead, Doug.
Thank you. This is for Alexandra. I'm wondering if anything even remotely resembling the consortium in New York is happening elsewhere, or if there are groups working in that direction, and if so, what kinds of support are they needing, and what can they teach the rest of us here in Massachusetts?
There's actually a great group working in Massachusetts that I'm going to butcher the name of because it's an acronym. But Dan French and Jack Schneider and that whole crew, the MCEIA consortium. Yeah, all right. They are trying in a very grassroots way to do the same thing, to build school districts commitment to different forms of assessment across all grades. So we really focus on high school, but they really are looking at all the way from K to 12. And it's really exciting work. And, we collaborate as much as we can across the states. But I would really, if you were interested in learning more about work in Massachusetts, they're doing great work. And they're also really doing important work on building vision for accountability of schools that is not based on tests. So they have a dashboard that they're building for the districts that they work in that gives a lot of different data and information about the schools for the community, because ultimately I think the replacement for sort of top-down federal accountability is really an accountability to the residents and the communities in which the schools are. So
thank you.
Hope that's helpful. If someone knows the correct acronym, please put it in the chat.
Yeah, Kathy actually did. Sounds like she knows all about it. I think we run through our questions, and so I'm going to turn it back over to Jonathan for any concluding words that may be appropriate. Okay, Kathy, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask everybody who is still on this call to do one thing, one phone call or one email or one connection to help us win question 2. Because this is immediate, it's in the next 10 days. We can win this if we get all the people who really believe us out there doing something. So if you've been sitting here for 3 hours, you can get up, stretch, and make a phone call, talk to your neighbor. Just please do something. Thanks.
Second, sitting out in my yard are 20,000 signatures from the original petition to end the MCAS, which were collected 20 years ago, 25 years ago, presented at the State House at an actually packed hearing at the Gardner Auditorium. And as pointed out by Kathy, the legislature way back then ignored the 20,000 signatures. On the other hand, right, her point about people getting out in the street and people power over dollars, right, until the last vote is counted. The only other thing I want to say, I mean, it is depressing, you know, the way the billionaires have explicitly, publicly now taken over, you know, blocking the editorial in the Washington Post, Elon Musk out there with Trump. On the other hand, you know, the Israel-Gaza mobilization is the broadest mobilization in the general community that we've seen in decades and decades, and those people aren't going away. They may have to figure out new ways of operating politically. Larry Cohen's focus on primary, I will say that our Massachusetts coalition of progressive organizations came to the same conclusion, that you had to rebuild the bench. You had to go for the primaries, and that itself was tough, just to find people to run in the primary. But you know, the nation is not going to immediately fall apart if some bad things happen, and those of us who have stayed the course so far continue to stay the course. So thank you all so much for hanging with us, and as Larry says, hard but not hopeless, and let's go out and see if we can do it. So, and we'll send out a recording to everybody who's a link to the recording to everybody who's registered. It takes a while to get that set up, but there's been some very, very valuable presentations, and I don't think we want to lose them. So, Cole, you have any last words?
No. Thanks everyone for joining in this effort to connect the issues of military spending with the need for stronger education system and reforms in our education policy. We have to get past this idea that these areas of policy are separate. They've been constructed that way to keep us divided. We have to unite our movements, and thank you for joining in this discussion today. Okay.
Solidarity.
Carolina.